This week, we begin with Module 4, which is focused on behaviorism. In this lecture, we're going to start with Ivan Pavlov and John B. Watson. Next week, we'll learn more about B.F. Skinner. We will start by learning more about behaviorism, what it is, why it developed, who contributed to it. Then we will learn about Ivan Pavlov and his conditioning studies. We will finish the lecture with John Watson, who is technically considered the founder of behaviorism. Let's begin with the simplest question. What is behaviorism? Just like functionalism, behaviorism had a big impact on the field of psychology. So much so that today we consider behaviorism to be the second force in psychology. Psychoanalysis is the first, and humanistic psychology is the third. These three forces make up the broadest perspectives in psychology, particularly in counseling and clinical psychology. We use psychoanalysis, behaviorism, and humanistic psychology to treat mental illnesses and mental disorders. Behaviorism was an entire school of thought that focused on, you guessed it, behaviors. Behaviorists did not study consciousness like functionalists, like structuralists, like Gestalt psychologists. The behaviorists focused solely on only those things that they could observe, behaviors, actions, words that have been said. Behaviorists started out by studying animal behavior and trying to understand how animals learn, how they solve problems, in order to draw inferences about human behavior. This perspective began to emerge in the 1910s and became popular in the late 1920s and early 1930s. Behaviorism is a point in psychology's history where we can clearly see a transition from psychology being the study of the unobservable to the observable, from studying the unconscious and even the conscious to studying people's actions, behaviors, the words they say. Behaviorists used the scientific method to study behavior. Their observations had to be verifiable by others, which means introspection would no longer suffice. Your subjective description of your experience of some stimuli cannot be verified by other people. I cannot verify whether that is the actual emotion that you felt or the thought that you had. You can essentially tell me anything you want when I use the introspective method. Behaviorists also valued the practical applications of their theories. They truly believed that if we can understand the environment in which an organism lives, then we can control that environment and therefore have some control over the behavior. With behaviorists, it was all about predicting behavior and then controlling behavior. The image on your screen is just an illustration of the basic steps of the scientific method. Behaviorists would start out by asking some kind of question. For instance, how does music impact consumer behavior? Does a store that plays music sell more products? They would ask a question like this, do some background research to better understand the question they are asking. They would develop a prediction, some type of hypothesis. They would conduct tightly controlled animal experiments. They would then analyze the data and draw some type of conclusion about human behavior based on their animal studies. As you might have guessed, behaviorists were also concerned about the different environmental factors that shape behavior. Yes, behavior was important to them, but they also paid attention to the organism's surroundings, the environment. Some said we learn through experience. Others said we learn as a result of rewards and punishments. Still others said we learn by forming associations between stimuli and responses to that stimuli. Behaviorists didn't always agree about the different factors that impacted behaviors, but they all focused on behaviors, on the observable, and they tried to pay attention to and collect information about the environment. They tried to control the environment in their animal studies. Even though behaviorism had an enormous impact on the field of psychology, its impact was limited to the United States of America. Behaviorism was really more of an American phenomenon. It was not as popular in Europe. In fact, Watson's original behaviorism did not immediately catch on. He published an article in 1913, and it took almost 15 years before the majority of American psychologists were familiar with and interested in studying from a behaviorist perspective. In the early 1900s, there were several other schools of thought that were also gaining popularity and competing for American psychologists' attention. Applied psychologists were using their principles to solve real-world problems in the classroom and in businesses. Gestalt psychology had been brought here from Germany by its three founders, and early cognitive psychologists were beginning to study memory, problem solving, learning. All of these things were happening in the early 1900s. By the 1930s, behaviorism was the dominant force among all of these different schools of thought.